long before he became known to the world as the shadowy and feared leader of the Islamic State, and long before his face became synonymous with global terror. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi lived a remarkably quiet, ordinary life in the heart of Iraq. Born on July 28, 1971, in the city of Samarra, north of Baghdad, he was given the birth name Ibrahim Awad Ibrahim Ali al-Badri. To those who knew his family during his childhood and youth, there was little outward sign that this unassuming, deeply religious young man would one day orchestrate a brutal global movement that would alter the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. Samarra itself was a city steeped in profound historical and religious significance, famous for its iconic spiral minaret of the Great Mosque and its status as a pilgrimage site containing the al-Zarqawi shrine, one of the most sacred sites in Shia Islam. Samarra was a place where ancient Islamic history was a daily reality. Yet, despite the sectarian sensitivities that would later tear the city and the country apart, al-Baghdadi's immediate family environment was rooted in traditional, conservative Sunni Islam. His family belonged to the al-Badri tribe, a clan that historically claimed lineage tracing back to the Prophet Muhammad through the Husseini line, a pedigree that would later be heavily exploited in his propaganda to legitimize his self-declared caliphate. Growing up during the regime of Saddam Hussein, al-Baghdadi's early life was shaped by the rigid socio-political framework of Ba'athist Iraq. While Saddam's regime was officially secular and suppressed political Islam that threatened state power, it paradoxically fostered a conservative social environment and, particularly in the wake of the 1991 Gulf War and subsequent international sanctions, experienced a state-sponsored faith campaign that re-emphasized traditional Islamic values, mosque construction, and religious education. In this environment, religion provided both solace and a pathway for social mobility for many young men of modest means. As a boy and a young man, al-Baghdadi was frequently described by acquaintances and neighbors as quiet, introverted, and intensely focused on religious studies. Unlike many of his peers who sought distraction in sports, popular culture, or the mundane routines of state-controlled youth organizations, Ibrahim dedicated his time to the memorization of the Quran and the rigorous study of classical Arabic grammar, theology, and Islamic jurisprudence. He spent countless hours at the local mosques in Samarra, where his soft-spoken demeanor and dedication to scriptural recitation earned him a reputation as a pious youth. He was often nicknamed the believer or a quiet cleric by those who crossed paths with him during these formative years, reflecting a persona that was studious rather than boisterous or aggressive. Seeking to further his education, al-Baghdadi eventually moved to the sprawling capital city of Baghdad in the late 1980s or early 1990s. Baghdad was a bustling metropolis of millions, combining ancient Islamic heritage with modern urban sprawl, bureaucratic institutions, and universities. It was here that his intellectual and religious worldview deepened significantly. He enrolled in academic programs focusing on Islamic studies, eventually attending the prestigious Saddam University for Islamic Studies, later renamed the University of Islamic Sciences, where he pursued advanced degrees, including a master's degree and later a doctorate in Quranic sciences. During his years in Baghdad, al-Baghdadi lived a modest existence, residing in humble neighborhoods such as Tabji and later working and studying in local mosques. It was during this period that his ideological leanings began to crystallize under the influence of various Salafi and Muslim Brotherhood thinkers who had found a foothold in Iraq's religious educational institutions. While Iraq's Salafi movement was initially quietist, focusing strictly on theology, personal piety, and the purification of religious practices rather than active political rebellion or armed jihad, the intellectual foundations being laid in these academic circles were crucial. Al-Baghdadi immersed himself in classical jurisprudence, memorizing extensive religious texts, and adopting an austere, uncompromising interpretation of Islamic law. It is essential to understand that during his time in Baghdad, prior to the 2003 American-led invasion, al-Baghdadi was not known as a militant, a political revolutionary, or a violent extremist. He was an academic and a cleric. He taught Quranic recitation, led prayers in local neighborhood mosques, and occasionally played football with neighborhood youths and seminary students. He was married, started a family, and maintained the outward appearance of a conventional, scholarly religious teacher. Those who interacted with him during this chapter of his life recalled a man who was deeply reserved, rarely raising his voice, and keeping a very low profile. However, the quiet scholarly environment in which al-Baghdadi operated was merely a precursor to the profound storms that would soon engulf his homeland. The strict academic study of medieval theology, combined with a growing rejection of secular governance and an increasing absorption of extremist literature circulating in underground networks, created a fertile psychological and intellectual framework. When the external pressures of war, foreign occupation, and societal collapse finally struck Iraq, this quiet preacher possessed the theological vocabulary and the ideological rigidity necessary to pivot swiftly from the quiet halls of academia into the dark, violent underworld of radical insurgency. The early life of Ibrahim al-Badri remains a study in contrasts. A conventional, pious upbringing in a historically rich Iraqi city, followed by years of dedicated academic study in the capital, all masking an internal radicalization that would only fully reveal itself once the pillars of the Iraqi state were violently swept away. This quiet beginning provided no obvious warning to the world, yet every sermon studied, every Quranic verse memorized, and every ideological seed planted during these years laid the groundwork for the emergence of one of history's most notorious militant leaders. As Ibrahim al-Badri continued his quiet life of study and prayer in the academic circles of Baghdad, the geopolitical fault lines beneath his feet were about to shatter completely. The peaceful, albeit tightly controlled, existence under the regime of Saddam Hussein was built on a fragile foundation of authoritarian stability. For decades, the Ba'ath Party maintained a strict grip on Iraqi society, ruthlessly suppressing political dissent, ethnic rebellions, and sectarian conflicts. However, this enforced stability masked deep, festering wounds and profound grievances among Iraq's diverse demographic groups. When the international landscape shifted dramatically at the dawn of the 21st century, the structural pillars holding Iraq together began to buckle. The defining catalyst for this immense catastrophe arrived in March 2003, when a United States-led coalition launched a full-scale military invasion of Iraq. The invasion was justified by Western governments under the assertion that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and maintained links to international terrorist networks. Regardless of the geopolitical debates surrounding the casus belli, the immediate military reality on the ground was swift and overwhelming. Conventional Iraqi military forces, exhausted by years of international economic sanctions, technological isolation, and low morale, collapsed in a matter of weeks. Statues of Saddam Hussein were pulled down in central Baghdad, government buildings were abandoned, and the entire apparatus of the Iraqi state dissolved into a chaotic vacuum. For a man like al-Badri, who had spent years navigating the intellectual and religious confines of Ba'athist institutions, the sudden disappearance of the central government was a moment of profound disorientation and opportunity. The state had regulated everything from education to religious preaching, ensuring that no alternative political or religious force could challenge its authority. With the state gone, that absolute monopoly vanished overnight. Into the resulting vacuum rushed a chaotic mix of returning exiles, foreign actors, ambitious local politicians, criminal syndicates, and, most crucially, a rising wave of religious extremism. The collapse of the regime was rapidly followed by decisions that would irrevocably seal the fate of the nation. Chief among these was the Coalition Provisional Authority's implementation of de-Baathification, a sweeping policy designed to purge former members of the ruling party from public life, government administration, and state services. Simultaneously, the American Occupation Authority ordered the complete dissolution of the Iraqi military, police, and security forces. Hundreds of thousands of armed, trained, and disciplined men, many of whom were Sunnis who had formed the backbone of the previous government, were suddenly stripped of their livelihoods, their status, and their sense of purpose. This mass disenfranchisement created an enormous pool of disgruntled, desperate individuals who felt alienated, humiliated, and deeply resentful of foreign occupation. As the pillars of the secular state crumbled, Iraq rapidly fractured along deep sectarian and ethnic lines. Under Saddam Hussein's rule, the Sunni Arab minority had held dominant political and military positions, while the Shia majority, representing over 60% of the population, faced systemic marginalization despite holding numerical superiority. With the old regime gone, the Shia majority demanded political representation commensurate with their demographic weight, supported by newly empowered political parties and religious figures who had long suffered under Ba'athist oppression. At the same time, the Kurdish population in northern Iraq seized the opportunity to solidify their de facto autonomy within their regional enclave. The delicate balance of power that had kept the country tethered together was permanently broken, replaced by an atmosphere of intense suspicion, fear, and zero-sum competition for national survival. This profound societal fracture quickly escalated into a vicious cycle of sectarian violence and insurgency. In the streets of Baghdad and cities across the country, ordinary life transformed into a daily struggle for basic security. Basic infrastructure, including electricity grids, water treatment plants, and healthcare facilities, lay shattered or looted. The crumbling security environment allowed criminal gangs to operate with impunity, leading to rampant kidnappings, robberies, and lawlessness. Into this explosive environment stepped underground Islamist networks that had previously been suppressed or operated on the distant peripheries of Iraqi society. These networks viewed the American presence not merely as a foreign occupation, but as a historic crusade against Islam itself, framing the chaos as an existential battleground. For religious scholars and clerics operating in the neighborhoods of Baghdad and Samarra, the atmosphere changed from one of academic detachment to one of intense urgency. Mosques became focal points not only for spiritual guidance, but for community organization, distribution of aid, and increasingly, radical political mobilization. Preachers who spoke out against the foreign occupation found massive, receptive audiences among young men who had lost their jobs, witnessed the destruction of their neighborhoods, or suffered the humiliation of military checkpoints and house raids. The theological concepts of resistance, martyrdom, and the defense of the faith began to resonate far beyond radical circles, seeping into the mainstream consciousness of a population pushed to the brink of despair. It was within this ruined, fractured landscape that the seeds of modern jihadism in Iraq were sown. The American-led invasion, intended by its architects to liberate the country and establish a democratic beacon in the Middle East, instead unleashed forces of sectarian hatred and institutional collapse that far exceeded the coalition's capacity to manage. The absence of effective governance, combined with the bitter grievances of a sidelined population, created a fertile breeding ground where extremist ideologies could take root, flourish, and eventually transform desperate individuals into fanatical fighters. For Ibrahim al-Badri, the transformation from a quiet, scholarly preacher into a hardened militant did not happen in a vacuum. It was forged directly in the crucible of a burning, broken Iraq, where the old world was dead and the new world was defined by endless war. The quiet intellectual isolation that Ibrahim al-Badri had maintained through his early studies and preaching in Samarra and Baghdad came to an abrupt, violent halt in the early years of the American occupation. As the insurgency gathered momentum, and the coalition forces ramped up their counter-terrorism operations to stem the tide of bombings and ambushes. Intelligence networks and night raids began sweeping through suspect neighborhoods. For an obscure religious scholar who moved within circles increasingly sympathetic to anti-coalition resistance, anonymity was becoming impossible to maintain. In the chaotic dragnet of occupied Iraq, where intelligence was frequently based on ambiguous tips, informants, and mass profiling, al-Badri was eventually detained by United States forces. His arrest and subsequent internment placed him inside a vast, rapidly expanding military detention system that the American military had erected to handle the thousands of suspected insurgents, foreign fighters, and political agitators captured across the country. Chief among these facilities was Camp Bakr, a sprawling desert prison located in the remote, sun-scorched landscapes of southern Iraq near the Kuwaiti border, as well as Abu Ghraib on the outskirts of Baghdad. These facilities, initially designed as temporary holding areas for prisoners of war, quickly swelled into massive, overcrowded encampments housing tens of thousands of detainees of varying backgrounds, ideologies, and levels of radicalization. It was within these high-security compounds that the trajectory of modern militancy in the Middle East underwent a radical, unintended transformation. Life inside Camp Bakr was harsh, austere, and defined by intense psychological pressure. Detainees were packed into massive tents surrounded by razor wire, watchtowers, and the relentless desert heat. Yet, beneath the surface of military control and barbed wire, the prison functioned as something entirely unforeseen by its captors, an elite university for jihadism. Before the invasion, Iraq's underground Islamist networks were fragmented, regional, and often at odds with one another. Secular Ba'athist military officers, intelligence operatives, and radical religious preachers had operated in distinct spheres. Camp Bakr and other coalition detention facilities shattered these boundaries, throwing disparate groups together into close, inescapable proximity for months or even years at a time. Within the compounds, prisoners organized themselves according to strict internal hierarchies. Former high-ranking officers from Saddam Hussein's elite Republican Guard and intelligence services, men who possessed invaluable operational, logistical, and tactical expertise, found themselves living shoulder to shoulder with zealous, ideologically driven religious extremists. Initially, many of the secular military officers looked down upon the religious radicals as fanatical zealots. However, under the shared trauma of imprisonment, interrogation, and the common enemy of foreign occupation, a pragmatic, symbiotic alliance began to forge. The military officers provided the tactical discipline, structural organization, and strategic blueprint for warfare, while the radical clerics provided the ideological justification, moral framework, and absolute fanaticism necessary to sustain a long-term insurgency. For Ibrahim al-Badri, who entered the prison system as a relatively quiet, scholarly figure known for his religious background and austere demeanor, the environment provided a unique platform. Unlike many of the loud, aggressive agitators who drew the immediate suspicion of prison guards, al-Badri maintained a low profile, projecting an image of quiet piety, scholarly authority, and moderate temperament. He spent his long hours leading prayers, teaching Quranic recitation, and arbitrating disputes among rival factions within the compound. His calm demeanor, religious credentials, and unassuming presence allowed him to navigate the complex social dynamics of the prison without triggering major alarms among the camp authorities. Behind this veneer of scholarly calm, however, al-Badri was deeply engaged in networking. The prison yards and crowded tents served as an unprecedented networking hub where future leaders of the insurgency could size each other up, share contacts, and plan for the future. Inmates traded intelligence, discussed battlefield strategies, and forged loyalties that would endure long after their release. Al-Badri rubbed shoulders with hardened veterans of foreign jihad, former Ba'athist security commanders, who would later become top military strategists for ISIS, and radical ideologues who shaped his understanding of political power and religious governance. The prison environment systematically stripped away whatever moderate inclinations remained, hardening his worldview into a rigid, uncompromising doctrine of militant resistance. Crucially, the American detention system served as a revolving door rather than a permanent neutralization mechanism. Due to a combination of overcrowding, shifting military priorities, lack of conclusive individual evidence, and formal prisoner release programs intended to signal reconciliation, thousands of detainees were eventually cleared and set free. When al-Badri was released from custody, deemed by some camp administrators to pose a low direct security threat due to his quiet behavior and lack of involvement in high-profile attacks, he walked out of the gates as a profoundly changed man. He was no longer merely a local preacher delivering sermons in neighborhood mosques. He was now an interconnected node within a hardened, highly organized network of radicalized veterans. The prison years had transformed him from an academic observer of religious texts into a seasoned political operator who understood how to build coalitions, leverage ideological fervor, and navigate the underground criminal and militant underworld. The relationships forged under the watchtowers of Camp Bakr and other detention centers created the foundational leadership core that would soon take control of Iraq's jihadist movement. When al-Badri returned to the fractured streets of a burning Iraq, he carried with him the blueprint, the network, and the ruthless ambition that would propel him from the shadows of prison life straight to the summit of global terrorism. The Iraq that Ibrahim al-Badri stepped back into upon his release from American detention was a fractured nation bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The quiet academic and neighborhood preacher who had walked into the military prison system had been fundamentally reshaped by the experience. Behind the prison walls, he had not merely survived the harsh conditions of confinement. He had meticulously cultivated relationships, studied the organizational dynamics of underground insurgency, and forged an invaluable network with hardened militants and former state security officers. When he crossed the threshold back into civilian life, he did so with a renewed sense of purpose, a sharper political acumen, and a direct line to the most dangerous extremist networks operating across the country. Yet, his transition from an obscure religious figure into a militant organizer did not happen overnight. It was a calculated, gradual evolution that required him to navigate the shadows of a collapsing society, balancing his public persona of scholarly piety with clandestine operational ambition. In the immediate aftermath of his release, al-Badri returned to familiar geographic territory, gravitating toward the restive regions of northern and central Iraq. Communities such as Samarra, Diyala, and the outskirts of Baghdad were deeply traumatized by the ongoing war, sectarian violence, and foreign military occupation. In these areas, local populations felt increasingly alienated, vulnerable, and abandoned by the newly formed, Shiite-dominated central government. Public infrastructure was shattered, electricity and clean water were scarce, and the constant hum of coalition surveillance drones and armored patrols served as a daily reminder of foreign dominion. This environment of deep-seated grievance, fear, and lawlessness provided the ultimate breeding ground for radical recruitment. People were desperate for protection, identity, and a sense of order in a world that had completely unraveled, and underground jihadist cells were aggressively moving to fill the vacuum. Al-Badri understood that his greatest asset during this delicate phase of his transition was his reputation as a quiet, learned religious scholar. Unlike the fiery, loud foreign fighters or aggressive insurgent field commanders who drew the immediate, hostile attention of both American patrols and rival militias, al-Badri projected an air of peaceful traditionalism and academic detachment. He resumed his religious activities, finding refuge within local mosques where he could deliver sermons, lead prayers, and interact with young, impressionable students and disaffected community members. To casual observers and local authorities who checked in on his background, he appeared to be nothing more than a traditional cleric trying to practice his faith amidst the chaos of war. He wore simple religious garb, maintained a humble demeanor, and spoke in measured, theological terms that resonated with people exhausted by ideological extremes. Beneath this facade of scholarly harmlessness, however, al-Badri was quietly embedding himself within the upper echelons of Iraq's burgeoning jihadist underground. The contacts he had secured inside the prison compounds were now active in the field, organizing safe houses, securing weapons caches, and establishing clandestine communication channels. These networks needed figures who possessed religious legitimacy, men who could arbitrate disputes between rival factions, provide theological justification for violent campaigns, and reassure prospective recruits that their actions aligned with divine law. Al-Badri's formal education in Islamic jurisprudence and his ability to articulate complex religious arguments made him uniquely qualified for this role. Slowly, his influence within the regional extremist ecosystem began to grow, shifting from a peripheral prisoner connection to an essential node for ideological coordination. As he moved deeper into the militant underworld, al-Badri began operating under various aliases and pseudonyms, a necessary precaution to evade the relentless tracking of coalition intelligence and Iraqi security forces. In the clandestine world of the insurgency, true identities were routinely masked behind traditional honorifics and nom de guerre. Within these circles, al-Badri was recognized not just as a preacher, but as a man of organizational capability and administrative precision. While other insurgent leaders focused entirely on military tactics, roadside bombings, and ambushes against coalition convoys, al-Badri recognized the importance of structure, religious courts, and ideological indoctrination. He began to position himself as a master builder of administrative cells, helping to coordinate logistics, manage safe houses, and distribute propaganda that framed the struggle not merely as a local nationalist resistance, but as an existential holy war. The transition from preacher to militant organizer also required al-Badri to navigate the dangerous, highly volatile politics of the broader jihadist movement in Iraq. At this time, the umbrella organization known as the Mujahideen Shura Council, and subsequently the Islamic State of Iraq, was operating under the ideological shadow of Al-Qaeda. The movement was dominated by fierce regional commanders, foreign operatives, and ruthless tactical leaders who demanded absolute loyalty and adherence to a global jihadist agenda. For an ambitious local cleric like al-Badri, surviving and rising within this brutal hierarchy meant treading a very careful line. He had to prove his unwavering dedication to the extremist cause while avoiding the kind of direct battlefield exposure that frequently ended in capture or targeted assassination by coalition forces. To achieve this, al-Badri focused his efforts on areas where he could build a loyal constituency and secure operational autonomy. He utilized his scholarly background to establish religious committees within the underground network, gaining control over how religious law was interpreted and enforced in areas slipping away from government control. By positioning himself as an authority on Sharia law, he could issue rulings that legitimized the group's actions, resolved internal disputes among competing factions, and enforced strict ideological discipline among new recruits. This bureaucratic and religious control proved just as powerful as military might, allowing him to weave himself deeply into the administrative backbone of the insurgency. By building alliances with former Ba'athist military officers whom he had befriended during his imprisonment, al-Badri helped bridge the dangerous ideological gap between secular military pragmatists and religious fundamentalists. The former officers brought tactical brilliance, strategic planning, and operational security to the underground movement, while al-Badri and other radical clerics provided the ideological glue, recruitment pipelines, and moral rationalization. This unique synthesis of military expertise and religious fanaticism transformed scattered, desperate insurgent cells into a disciplined, highly structured shadow government that was quietly preparing to challenge the very foundations of the Iraqi state. As the years progressed, al-Badri's profile within the movement continued its steady ascent. He was no longer just an observer or a local facilitator. He was becoming a central pillar of the organization's leadership core. His ability to operate largely in the shadows, avoiding the high-profile slip-ups that cost many of his peers their lives, allowed him to accumulate power quietly and methodically. He understood that the chaos of the occupation and the weakness of the state presented a historic window of opportunity, and he positioned himself to capitalize on it completely. The quiet preacher who had once studied texts in Samarra had successfully transformed into a hardened militant strategist, armed with a deep network, a rigid ideology, and the quiet, ruthless ambition to claim ultimate leadership of the jihadist movement. The quiet streets of Iraq's cities and towns were shadowed by a heavy, menacing cloud as the insurgency evolved through the mid-2000s. At the center of this violent transformation stood the imposing and terrifying figure of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian militant who had established al-Qaeda in Iraq. Zarqawi was a man of immense brutality and relentless ambition. He believed that the path to a pure Islamic state required a total, unyielding war not only against foreign American forces, but specifically against Iraq's Shiite majority population. His strategy relied on horrific sectarian bombings, targeted assassinations, and public executions designed to ignite a full-scale civil war between Sunnis and Shiites. For Zarqawi, violence was not merely a tactic. It was the primary language of politics and ideology. He demanded absolute obedience from all allied factions and operated with a fierce, uncompromising independence that often shocked even the core leadership of al-Qaeda in distant Pakistan. While Zarqawi commanded the headlines, drew the primary focus of American military intelligence, and dominated the battlefield with his campaign of terror, other figures were working quietly within the shadows of the organization. Among them was Ibrahim al-Badri, who would later become known to the world as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Operating far away from the chaotic front lines where Zarqawi's men fought coalition patrols, al-Badri played a completely different game. He understood that raw violence alone could not sustain an underground movement over the long term. While Zarqawi was a destroyer of states, al-Badri was a builder of administrative structures. He focused on establishing religious courts, resolving internal disputes among competing insurgent groups, and managing the clandestine distribution of funds, weapons, and propaganda. This division of labor allowed al-Badri to expand his influence steadily without drawing the fatal attention that constantly hovered over Zarqawi and his inner circle. The relationship between local Iraqi insurgent networks and al-Qaeda's foreign leadership was always fraught with deep tension and mutual suspicion. Al-Qaeda Corps, led by Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, viewed Iraq through the lens of a global struggle against Western imperialism. They worried that Zarqawi's extreme sectarian violence and indiscriminate slaughter of Muslim civilians were alienating the very local populations they needed to win over. Bin Laden and Zawahiri sent private letters and emissaries urging Zarqawi to moderate his tactics, focus his attacks primarily on foreign troops, and build broader coalitions with local Iraqi tribes and community leaders. Zarqawi, however, largely ignored these warnings, doubling down on his strategy of sectarian polarization and cementing his status as a ruthless warlord who answered to no one. Al-Badri observed these high-stakes ideological struggles with careful, calculated neutrality. He recognized the immense propaganda value of al-Qaeda's global brand, which carried profound weight and prestige among radical Islamists worldwide. Aligning with al-Qaeda provided access to foreign fighters, financial networks, and a ready-made ideological framework that legitimized their armed struggle. At the same time, al-Badri was acutely aware of the dangers posed by foreign leadership dictating terms to local Iraqis. He positioned himself as a bridge between the foreign elements and the domestic insurgency. Using his scholarly background in Islamic jurisprudence, he could speak the language of traditional religious law, making him invaluable to an organization that desperately needed to justify its actions to skeptical local communities. As the war dragged on, the heavy military pressure applied by United States forces began to close in on al-Qaeda in Iraq. In June 2006, a precise American airstrike in a rural area near Baqubah targeted and killed Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. His death dealt a massive psychological blow to the extremist network and left a gaping leadership vacuum at the top. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the organization might fracture under the weight of military pressure and internal divisions. However, the group quickly regrouped, choosing an Egyptian militant known as Abu Ayyub al-Masri to lead the military wing, while simultaneously announcing the formation of the Islamic State of Iraq, a political umbrella intended to project local governance and statehood rather than just a foreign terrorist cell. This structural pivot toward creating a pseudo-state entity aligned perfectly with al-Badri's long-term vision. He understood that the future of the movement lay not in nomadic guerrilla bands hiding in the desert, but in capturing territory, controlling local populations, and establishing a functioning shadow government. While the public face of the Islamic State of Iraq was dominated by commanders and military emirs, al-Badri continued to work diligently behind the scenes. He solidified his control over the organization's religious and judicial apparatus, ensuring that every decree, execution, and territorial expansion was backed by a strict theological justification. He appointed judges, managed Sharia courts, and oversaw the indoctrination of new recruits, embedding himself deeply into the administrative machinery of the jihadist state. Internal struggles within the organization continued to simmer beneath the surface. The creation of the Islamic State of Iraq caused friction with other nationalist insurgent groups who resented al-Qaeda's attempts to dominate the entire resistance movement. Many Sunni tribes, who had initially tolerated or even collaborated with the insurgency out of fear or anger toward the central government, grew increasingly exhausted by the extremists' brutal enforcement of strict religious rules and public punishments. This widespread exhaustion eventually culminated in the Anbar Awakening, a massive tribal revolt backed by the United States military that turned local populations decisively against al-Qaeda and the Islamic State of Iraq, pushing them out of their traditional strongholds in western Iraq. Faced with this existential crisis, many extremist leaders panicked or were killed in the renewed fighting, but al-Badri demonstrated a remarkable capacity for political survival. He did not tie his personal safety or reputation to the failing military campaigns in the open desert. Instead, he retreated further into the urban underground of Baghdad, Mosul, and Diyala, blending seamlessly into civilian neighborhoods where his scholarly demeanor protected him from suspicion. He maintained his low profile, avoiding the fiery rhetoric and public boasts that marked the ends of so many of his peers. While the military wing of the Islamic State of Iraq was severely degraded by coalition forces and tribal awakenings during the late 2000s, al-Badri preserved his network, protected his faction's core administrative cadres, and quietly prepared for the next great upheaval. The shadow of al-Qaeda had shaped the early years of al-Badri's militant career, teaching him harsh lessons about the dangers of overreach, the necessity of local roots, and the immense power of administrative control. He had watched iconic leaders rise, burn brightly, and fall under the weight of American firepower and strategic blunders. By learning from their mistakes, al-Badri honed a patient, secretive, and deeply institutional approach to revolutionary warfare. He was no longer just a minor cleric or a prison-made radical. He was a senior strategist within a bruised and battered underground movement that was waiting for the right moment to rise from the ashes. The turbulent partnership with al-Qaeda had provided the vehicle, but al-Baghdadi's own cold, methodical patience would soon steer that vehicle toward a terrifying new destiny. The year 2010 marked a profound turning point for the fractured extremist movement in Iraq, a moment that would reshape the geography of global terrorism. For years, the Islamic State of Iraq had suffered catastrophic blows. The relentless pressure of American counterterrorism operations, combined with the massive tribal backlash of the Anbar Awakening, had systematically dismantled its leadership structure, driven its fighters out of their traditional strongholds, and pushed the organization to the absolute brink of destruction. In April 2010, a joint U.S. and Iraqi military raid in a safe house near Tikrit dealt yet another devastating psychological and operational shock. Abu Ayyub al-Masri, the Egyptian military commander, and Abu Omar al-Baghdadi, the nominal leader of the Islamic State of Iraq, were both killed in a precision strike. The group was left headless, decentralized, and seemingly on the verge of complete dissolution. Yet, deep within the clandestine networks of Baghdad and the surrounding provinces, a quiet operator had been positioning himself for this exact vacuum. Ibrahim al-Badri, known by his nom de guerre, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, did not possess the fiery, charismatic bravado of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, nor did he command the international renown of al-Qaeda's central leadership. Instead, he possessed something far more dangerous in the underground world of clandestine warfare: absolute patience, deep bureaucratic integration, and the trust of surviving veteran operatives who valued survival over grandstanding. Following the deaths of al-Masri and Abu Omar, the Consultative Council of the Islamic State of Iraq convened in secret and selected al-Baghdadi as their new emir. He assumed command of a battered, cash-strapped organization that controlled very little territory and operated mostly in the shadows, hunted relentlessly by the world's most sophisticated intelligence apparatus. Upon taking the reins, al-Baghdadi immediately set out to restructure the organization from the ground up, moving away from erratic violence and toward a cold, methodical consolidation of power. He recognized that the previous failures stemmed from poor administrative control, alienation of local populations, and a lack of clear strategic direction. To remedy this, he surrounded himself with a tight circle of former Ba'athist military officers who had served under Saddam Hussein and subsequently radicalized inside American detention facilities like Camp Bucca. These men brought invaluable tactical discipline, operational secrecy, and structural organization to the jihadist movement. While traditional jihadists provided religious zeal and ideological fanaticism, the former military officers provided logistics, intelligence gathering, and battle-tested command and control frameworks. Al-Baghdadi successfully bridged these two disparate worlds, fusing religious extremism with cold, military pragmatism. Under his guidance, the Islamic State of Iraq began a slow, calculated resurgence. Rather than launching massive, high-profile spectacles that invited immediate military retaliation, al-Baghdadi ordered his cells to focus on targeted assassinations, prison breaks, and low-level bombings designed to demoralize the Iraqi security forces and demonstrate the impotence of the central government in Baghdad. One of his most ambitious early campaigns was the systematic targeting of state infrastructure and correctional facilities. Throughout 2012 and 2013, orchestrated assaults on major prisons, most notably the Abu Ghraib and Taji prison breaks, freed hundreds of hardened veteran militants and experienced bomb makers. These coordinated operations injected fresh blood and lethal expertise back into the organization, rapidly expanding its operational capacity. While rebuilding his forces at home, al-Baghdadi was also casting his eyes across the western border toward a historic opportunity unfolding in neighboring Syria. In March 2011, the outbreak of the Syrian civil war and the violent government crackdown on anti-regime protests plunged the nation into deep chaos. As the conflict escalated into a brutal multi-sided civil war, vast swaths of Syrian territory slipped beyond the control of President Bashar al-Assad's government. Al-Baghdadi recognized that Syria offered the ultimate geopolitical incubator: a fractured state, porous borders, abundant weapon supplies, and millions of vulnerable, displaced people ripe for radicalization and exploitation. He understood that whoever controlled the territory on the ground would ultimately dictate the future of the regional insurgency. In early 2012, acting with characteristic cunning, al-Baghdadi dispatched a trusted and ruthless operative named Abu Muhammad al-Julani into Syria to establish an underground branch of the organization. This covert expansion was designed to operate under a different banner, taking advantage of the rising local anti-regime sentiment without immediately alarming international observers or triggering resistance from existing Syrian rebel factions. This Syrian offshoot quickly grew in strength, attracting thousands of disaffected fighters, foreign volunteers, and radicalized locals who were eager to overthrow the Damascus government. Al-Baghdadi provided this Syrian branch with money, weapons, battle-tested leadership, and strategic guidance, effectively laying the foundation for a powerful transnational empire that would soon transcend the artificial borders drawn by European colonial powers decades earlier. As the Syrian affiliate expanded its reach, capturing towns and establishing local governance, tensions began to simmer regarding who held ultimate authority over the expansion. Al-Baghdadi viewed the Syrian branch not as an independent entity, but as a direct extension and subordinate wing of his own Islamic State of Iraq. He had funded its creation, supplied its leadership, and directed its strategic maneuvers from his hiding places in Iraq. However, the Syrian leadership, growing in confidence and local popularity, began to chafe at the idea of taking direct orders from Baghdad. They preferred to operate with greater autonomy, cultivating local alliances with other Syrian opposition groups rather than imposing immediate, draconian religious rule that might alienate the Syrian populace. Unfazed by local friction, al-Baghdadi remained steadfast in his long-term vision of statehood. He operated with the mindset of a sovereign ruler rather than a mere guerrilla leader. He established intricate administrative committees to oversee finances, military recruitment, weapons procurement, and media propaganda. He understood that in the modern era, perception and narrative were just as important as bullets and explosives. Under his supervision, the organization began producing sophisticated media releases, high-definition videos, and multilingual propaganda materials that projected an image of unstoppable momentum, administrative efficiency, and unyielding religious purity. This sophisticated media apparatus was carefully calibrated to appeal to disaffected Sunni youths across the Middle East and disillusioned radicals across Western nations, drawing a steady stream of foreign fighters into the conflict zones. By late 2012 and early 2013, the fruits of al-Baghdadi's patient consolidation were becoming impossible to ignore. The Islamic State of Iraq was no longer the hunted, fragmented remnant of a defeated insurgency that had survived the Anbar awakening. It was a revitalized, heavily armed, and professionally structured proto-state that operated with ruthless efficiency across two nations. Al-Baghdadi had transformed himself from an obscure religious scholar and administrative manager into the undisputed commander of a terrifying regional juggernaut. He had navigated the deadliest years of the post-invasion chaos, outlasted his rivals, and exploited the misery of a collapsing regional order to build a formidable engine of conquest. The stage was now set for a dramatic, high-stakes confrontation not only with the governments of Iraq and Syria, but with the global coalition and even his own erstwhile allies in al-Qaeda. The simmering friction between Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and the central leadership of al-Qaeda finally burst into an open, irreconcilable breach in the spring of 2013, shattering the fragile ideological unity of the global jihadist movement. For years, the relationship between the old guard of al-Qaeda, safely tucked away in the remote mountain ranges along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and its assertive franchise in Iraq had been strained by strategic disagreements. Ayman al-Zawahiri, who had assumed the global leadership of al-Qaeda following the death of Osama bin Laden in 2011, preferred a cautious, long-term approach. Zawahiri envisioned regional affiliates acting as quiet local catalysts, working patiently alongside other Sunni insurgent groups, avoiding premature declarations of statehood, and maintaining a low international profile to prevent drawing overwhelming retaliation from Western superpowers. He viewed the chaotic conflicts of the Middle East through the lens of a protracted war of attrition against the distant American enemy. Al-Baghdadi, however, operated with an entirely different philosophy and a much more immediate sense of geographic ambition. Safely ensconced in the fertile battlegrounds of the Levant and Mesopotamia, he viewed patience not as a virtue, but as a sign of weakness and hesitation. He believed that the historic collapse of state authority across Iraq and Syria represented a once-in-a-lifetime divine opportunity to establish actual territorial governance right then and there. Rather than waiting for a distant global victory, al-Baghdadi wanted to build an immediate physical caliphate, complete with borders, ministries, tax collection, and religious courts. This fundamental disagreement over timing, governance, and regional strategy set the stage for a dramatic and historic confrontation that would permanently alter the landscape of international terrorism. The breaking point arrived in April 2013 through a unilateral move that caught both al-Qaeda Central and its Syrian branch completely off guard. Without consulting Ayman al-Zawahiri or securing the approval of al-Qaeda's consultative council, al-Baghdadi recorded and released an audacious audio message that sent shockwaves through the jihadist world. In this public announcement, he declared that the Syrian offshoot, known up to that point as Jabhat al-Nusra or the al-Nusra Front, was no longer a separate entity. Instead, al-Baghdadi declared that it had been officially dissolved and merged with the Islamic State of Iraq to form a brand new, unified organization, the Islamic State in Iraq and al-Sham, commonly known as ISIS. To al-Baghdadi, this was simply a logical administrative correction. He had funded the Syrian branch, appointed its initial leadership, and supplied its weapons, so absorbing it into his growing empire seemed entirely within his sovereign rights as emir. However, the leadership of Jabhat al-Nusra reacted to the announcement with profound shock, defiance, and immediate rejection. Abu Muhammad al-Julani, the commander of the Syrian branch, whom al-Baghdadi had originally dispatched across the border, found himself caught in an impossible political and operational bind. Julani had worked painstakingly over the previous year to build deep, cooperative relationships with other non-extremist and mainstream Syrian rebel factions who were fighting to overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad. These local Syrian rebels viewed al-Baghdadi's uncompromising authoritarianism, foreign fighters, and radical social policies with deep suspicion and fear. If Julani meekly accepted al-Baghdadi's decree and folded his forces into the newly minted ISIS, he would instantly alienate his local Syrian allies, shatter the domestic anti-regime coalition, and brand his fighters as foreign puppets in the eyes of the local population. In a dramatic move that defied his former mentor, Abu Muhammad al-Julani publicly rejected the merger. In his own audio statement, Julani bypassed al-Baghdadi entirely and took a step that stunned observers. He swore a direct oath of allegiance of bay'ah not to al-Baghdadi, but directly to al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. By appealing straight to the top of the global hierarchy, Julani sought to legitimize his independent existence and protect his organization from being swallowed whole by the ambitious Iraqi commander. This maneuver effectively split the movement in two. Jabhat al-Nusra remained officially affiliated with al-Qaeda Central as its recognized Syrian branch, while al-Baghdadi and his loyalists broke away completely, charting an independent course that recognized no superior authority above al-Baghdadi's own consultative council. The intervention of Ayman al-Zawahiri only served to deepen the rift and expose the fading influence of al-Qaeda's elderly leadership over the dynamic, ruthless new generation of fighters on the ground. Attempting to resolve the bitter dispute, Zawahiri issued a formal written ruling in June 2013. He declared that al-Baghdadi's unilateral declaration of the merger was legally null and void, that the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham should be immediately dissolved, and that both the Iraqi and Syrian branches should operate as separate, independent entities within their respective national borders under the overall umbrella of al-Qaeda. Zawahiri explicitly ruled that al-Baghdadi's authority was strictly confined to Iraq, and that Jabhat al-Nusra answered directly to al-Qaeda Central regarding its operations inside Syria. Al-Baghdadi's response to al-Qaeda's supreme leader was swift, defiant, and thoroughly contemptuous of old organizational hierarchies. Rather than stepping down, dissolving his new organization, or accepting Zawahiri's arbitration, al-Baghdadi released an extensive audio rebuttal rejecting the ruling entirely. He argued that al-Zawahiri's instructions were legally flawed, historically out of touch with the realities on the ground, and detrimental to the jihadist cause. Citing religious jurisprudence, al-Baghdadi asserted his absolute independence and vowed to press forward with the expansion of his organization, regardless of what the aging mountainside leaders in Pakistan commanded. He made it clear that he answered only to God and his own inner circle, effectively declaring independence from the global movement that had birthed his career. This open defiance marked a historic schism within the global jihadist ecosystem. For nearly 2 decades, al-Qaeda had enjoyed undisputed hegemony as the central clearinghouse, ideological beacon, and supreme authority for radical Islamist militant groups worldwide. By publicly rejecting Zawahiri's orders, al-Baghdadi shattered that monopoly. He demonstrated that local military strength, territorial control, and financial self-sufficiency mattered far more in modern civil wars than traditional organizational loyalty or seniority. Al-Baghdadi was no longer just a regional franchise manager taking orders from abroad. He was the head of an autonomous, aggressive, and wealthy rival organization that intended to reshape the Middle East on its own terms. The split quickly escalated from a war of words into a bitter, violent operational conflict on the ground in Syria. As foreign volunteers and battle-hardened veterans flooded across the porous borders, fighters had to choose which banner to serve under. Thousands of radical foreign jihadists, who were drawn to al-Baghdadi's uncompromising vision of immediate statehood and decisive action, abandoned al-Qaeda and flocked to ISIS. Conversely, many local Syrian fighters and those who favored a more gradualist approach remained with Jabhat al-Nusra. Throughout the latter half of 2013, the friction between the two rival extremist factions began to degenerate into open armed skirmishes, assassinations, and turf wars across rebel-held territories in northern and eastern Syria. This internal civil war within the insurgency provided a temporary tactical breathing room for the embattled regime of Bashar al-Assad, as the various rebel groups turned their weapons upon one another instead of focusing entirely on Damascus. However, it also highlighted the ruthless pragmatism and organizational discipline that al-Baghdadi brought to his enterprise. While al-Qaeda Central issued polite theological letters from afar, al-Baghdadi deployed cash, weapons, suicide bombers, and loyal commanders to seize territory, intimidate rivals, and forcefully expand his footprint across Syrian towns and villages. He understood that possession of physical ground was the ultimate currency of power in a collapsing state. The historic break with al-Qaeda transformed ISIS from a regional Iraqi insurgency into an independent transnational threat. By severing his ties with the old guard, al-Baghdadi freed himself from the constraints of global strategy and ideological moderation. He could now implement his radical vision of state building without interference, using the chaotic laboratory of the Syrian civil war to test administrative models, recruitment pipelines, and military tactics. The split proved that al-Baghdadi was not merely a survivor of the post-invasion chaos in Iraq, but a brilliant, cold-blooded strategist who was willing to challenge the established hierarchy of global terrorism to achieve his ultimate ambition: the creation of a territorial empire. The bitter ideological break with Al-Qaeda and the fierce turf wars fought across the battlefields of Syria did not slow Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi down. Instead, they served as a brutal proving ground for his growing army. By the early months of 2014, the organization formerly known as the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham had transformed into a lean, highly disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient military machine. Al-Baghdadi and his top commanders had spent years refining their combat tactics through brutal guerrilla warfare against American and Iraqi forces, learning how to operate in the shadows, utilize sleeper cells, and launch sudden, coordinated assaults. Now, they were ready to transition from a hidden insurgency into a conquering conventional army. The stage for this explosive expansion was set by a toxic political climate in Iraq that had been festering for years. Following the withdrawal of American combat troops in late 2011, Iraq's central government in Baghdad, led by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, pursued an increasingly sectarian and authoritarian course. Sunnis across central and western Iraq felt systematically marginalized, harassed, and disenfranchised by a political system dominated by the Shiite majority. Peaceful protests, staged by Sunni communities demanding equal rights, the release of detained relatives, and an end to discriminatory laws were met with heavy-handed police crackdowns and mass arrests. Al-Baghdadi and his recruiters watched this rising tide of local resentment with predatory patience. They positioned themselves not just as religious warriors, but as the violent vanguard and protectors of the alienated Sunni population. While al-Baghdadi concentrated on grand strategy, his military commanders, many of them former high-ranking officers from Saddam Hussein's dismantled National Army who had radicalized inside American detention facilities, brought professional tactical acumen to the jihadist ranks. They organized the fighters into structured battalions, established secure communications networks, and stockpiled vast amounts of weapons, ammunition, and military vehicles. Crucially, they also built an extensive network of secret sympathizers, informants, and sleeper cells inside key urban centers across northern and western Iraq. These local networks would provide vital inside support when the time came to strike, allowing ISIS to bypass heavy defenses and collapse government authority from the inside out. The first major sign of this new operational capability came in January 2014, when ISIS forces launched a sudden, coordinated offensive and seized total control of Fallujah and parts of Ramadi in Iraq's vast western Anbar province. For years, Fallujah had been a graveyard for American Marines during the bloody battles of the occupation. Now, flying their black banners from municipal buildings and police stations, ISIS fighters walked openly through the streets, demonstrating that they could capture and hold major urban territory right under the nose of the Iraqi military. Baghdad's security forces, plagued by rampant corruption, poor morale, ghost soldiers, and crumbling logistical chains, proved completely incapable of rolling back the militant advance. Yet, the true climax of this lightning conquest arrived in June 2014 with an offensive that shocked the entire world. In a matter of days, a relatively small force of several thousand heavily armed ISIS fighters launched a sweeping assault out of the desert toward Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, home to over 1 million residents and protected by tens of thousands of heavily equipped government troops. Despite outnumbering the attackers by a massive margin, the Iraqi Defense Force suffered a catastrophic moral and structural collapse. As the black-clad militants advanced in long columns of pickup trucks and captured armored Humvees, panic swept through the military ranks. High-ranking officers abandoned their posts, discarded their uniforms in the streets, and fled eastward toward the Kurdish Autonomous Region, leaving behind massive stockpiles of brand-new American-supplied weapons, tanks, artillery, and millions of dollars in cash left in bank vaults. Mosul fell almost without a shot, tumbling like a house of cards into the hands of al-Baghdadi's organization. The sudden capture of Iraq's northern metropolis sent shockwaves through regional capitals and Western intelligence agencies alike. It was a historic turning point that fundamentally redrew the geopolitical map of the Middle East. Overnight, ISIS went from being a regional terrorist group to a self-financing, quasi-state entity controlling a vast continuous swath of territory stretching from the outskirts of Aleppo in western Syria all the way down to the central plains of Iraq. The organization seized oil fields, agricultural centers, border crossings, and industrial infrastructure, instantly acquiring billions of dollars in economic resources that made it the richest non-state armed group in modern history. The human cost of this lightning conquest was immediate and catastrophic. As the black banners rose over government buildings, schools, and mosques across northern Iraq, hundreds of thousands of civilians fled in terror, creating massive humanitarian refugee crises along internal borders. Ethnic and religious minorities, particularly Christians, Yazidis, Shiite Turkmen, and Shabaks, faced immediate persecution, forced displacement, and brutal violence at the hands of the advancing militants who viewed them through a lens of extreme sectarian intolerance. International news channels broadcast endless footage of terrified families crowding onto dusty roads, desperate to escape the sudden collapse of their world. In Baghdad, the government scrambled in absolute panic to halt the relentless advance. Prime Minister Nuri al-Maliki issued desperate calls for international military assistance, while influential Shiite religious leaders in Najaf issued urgent fatwas calling upon citizens to take up arms in defense of the country. Thousands of young volunteers flocked to hastily formed Shiite militias to stem the tide. However, the damage was already done. The Iraqi security apparatus was shattered, the nation was fracturing along bitter sectarian fault lines, and the international community woke up to the grim reality that a new, hyper-violent empire had been born in the heart of the modern Middle East. Al-Baghdadi's gamble had paid off beyond his wildest expectations, setting the stage for his ultimate, grandiose declaration. Following the stunning collapse of Iraqi defenses and the lightning conquest of Mosul, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi prepared to step out of the shadows and make a move that would stun the international community. For years, he had operated as an underground militant, a shadowy figure known only through a handful of low-resolution photographs and aliases. But the capture of northern and western Iraq changed the entire equation. With vast territory under his control, millions of people under his rule, and billions of dollars in captured assets, al-Baghdadi decided it was time to transform his organization from a militant group into something much grander. He sought to resurrect a historical institution that had been dead for nearly a century: the Islamic Caliphate. On the first day of Ramadan in June 2014, a video was released across extremist online networks that would change the trajectory of the modern Middle East. The footage was filmed inside the historic Great Mosque of Al-Nuri in the heart of Mosul, an architectural masterpiece famous for its iconic leaning minaret, known locally as the Hunchback. Built in the 12th century, the mosque carried deep historical and religious resonance across the Islamic world. Al-Baghdadi chose this specific location to project authority, legitimacy, and historical continuity, standing before a large wooden pulpit to address his followers in person for the very first time as a public figure. Dressed entirely in black robes and wearing a black turban, an appearance carefully designed to mimic historical Islamic leaders and early caliphs, al-Baghdadi cut an imposing and deliberate figure. His long, dark beard was tinged with gray, and he wore a metallic watch on his wrist, a detail that later drew widespread fascination and internet commentary. For roughly 20 minutes, he delivered a carefully orchestrated sermon known as a khutbah. His voice was calm, measured, and deliberate, carrying an air of absolute authority. He did not speak with the frantic, shouting cadence of a radical street preacher. Instead, he spoke with the quiet confidence of a sovereign ruler claiming his divine right. During his address, al-Baghdadi announced the official establishment of a worldwide caliphate. He declared that the group formerly known as the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham was dropping its regional limitations and would henceforth be known simply as the Islamic State. Furthermore, he proclaimed himself as the Caliph, Ibrahim, and demanded that all Muslims around the globe swear allegiance to him as their supreme religious and political leader. He framed this moment not as the creation of a new militant faction, but as the restoration of a sacred duty that had been lost since the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924. He called upon Muslims of all professions, doctors, engineers, scholars, and soldiers, to pack up their lives and migrate to the newly declared territory to build what he described as a utopian Islamic society. The symbolism behind the declaration was meticulously planned to exploit deep religious history and geopolitical grievance. By adopting the title of Caliph, al-Baghdadi directly challenged the legitimacy of every existing government in the Middle East, as well as the leadership of rival jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda, which had long argued that the time was not right for a caliphate because the necessary conditions had not been met. Al-Baghdadi dismissed these arguments, asserting that power and territory superseded patience and caution. The announcement was a direct gauntlet thrown down before the international community, declaring that the borders drawn by European powers a century prior under the Sykes-Picot Agreement were officially erased. The global reaction to the speech was one of shock, disbelief, and mounting alarm. Western intelligence agencies, which had spent years hunting a shadowy terrorist commander, suddenly found themselves staring at a man openly claiming leadership over millions of people across two sovereign nations. Governments in Washington, London, Paris, and regional capitals realized that the conflict had entered a completely new phase. What had started as a localized insurgency in the ashes of the Iraq War had mutated into a global ideological magnet, capable of drawing thousands of foreign fighters from Europe, North America, Asia, and North Africa who were inspired by the propaganda and the romanticized vision of a functioning Islamic State. Yet, behind the grand religious rhetoric and the carefully staged theater of the pulpit, the reality of the caliphate was built on violence, terror, and subjugation. The declaration of the caliphate institutionalized policies of extreme religious intolerance, systemic persecution of minorities, and total subjugation of the local population. Dissent was met with public executions, corporal punishment, and draconian laws that tightly controlled every aspect of daily life, from clothing and education to commerce and media. The Great Mosque of Al-Nuri, where al-Baghdadi had stood to claim his throne, became the physical monument of this dark era, symbolizing both the peak of his ambition and the beginning of a catastrophic global confrontation that would eventually draw the might of the entire world down upon his head. The man who now called himself Caliph Ibrahim sat on a throne of blood, terror, and conquered dust, yet the world outside his expanding empire knew almost nothing about his actual daily life. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi had spent his entire adult life slipping through shadows, shifting aliases, and avoiding the glaring lights of modern media. Even after he climbed the wooden pulpit of the Great Mosque of Al-Nuri in Mosul to declare a worldwide Islamic empire in June 2014, he did not transform into a public celebrity who gave live television interviews, held press conferences, or walked openly among the citizens he claimed to rule. Instead, he retreated even deeper into absolute secrecy, carefully cultivating a mysterious persona that turned him into an untouchable myth. This deliberate choice of extreme isolation was not merely a personal preference. It was a calculated survival strategy born from the brutal realities of modern warfare. Al-Baghdadi was fully aware that the world's most sophisticated intelligence agencies, armed with high-altitude spy planes, advanced satellite imagery, encrypted communications tracking, and relentless drone surveillance, were hunting him night and day. He knew that a single electronic signal from a mobile phone, a stray conversation intercepted by an antenna, or a compromised courier could bring a Hellfire missile screaming down upon his roof within minutes. To stay alive, he had to strip away every trace of modern digital life, cutting himself off from the very tools of communication that his organization used so effectively to recruit followers across the globe. Inside the upper ranks of the Islamic State, al-Baghdadi became known as the Invisible Commander or the Shadowy Emir. Those few loyal deputies and senior commanders who were granted a direct audience with him had to follow strict, paranoid security protocols. Couriers would pick up commanders and drive them for hours in vehicles with blackened windows, spinning through winding streets and rural backroads so they could never figure out the actual location of his safe house. Before entering his presence, visitors were routinely forced to surrender all watches, rings, pens, and electronic devices. They were often searched multiple times by trusted guards who watched every move with suspicious eyes. When they finally stood before him, they found a quiet, soft-spoken man who rarely raised his voice, choosing instead to project an aura of calm, religious authority that cowed even the most violent and hardened foreign fighters into absolute obedience. While al-Baghdadi lived in the shadows, his media machine worked in broad daylight, flooding the global internet with a carefully engineered mythology designed to magnify his power. The central media office of the Islamic State operated like a Hollywood studio, producing high-definition magazines, slickly edited documentary-style videos, and audio speeches that echoed across social media platforms like Twitter and Telegram. These materials were translated into dozens of languages, reaching disaffected youth from London to Jakarta, painting al-Baghdadi not as a fugitive hiding in a basement, but as a fearless, visionary leader restoring the lost dignity of the Muslim Ummah. The propaganda portrayed him as an ascetic scholar who cared nothing for worldly wealth, sleeping on simple mats, eating plain food, and dedicating every waking moment to the enforcement of divine law. This stark, austere image stood in sharp contrast to the corrupt dictators who ruled traditional Middle Eastern states, making his appeal potent to those desperate for radical change. Yet, this carefully crafted myth clashed sharply with the grim reality on the ground inside his collapsing administrative zones. While the propaganda machine broadcasted images of smoothly running hospitals, bustling markets, and happy children playing in clean streets, the actual governance of the Caliphate was collapsing under the weight of corruption, paranoia, and internal brutality. Al-Baghdadi delegated day-to-day military and administrative control to ruthless provincial governors and foreign commanders, many of whom ruled through fear and arbitrary violence. Anyone suspected of spying, dissent, or minor violations of strict moral codes was subjected to public punishments that shocked international observers. The gap between the romanticized myth of a utopian Islamic society and the dystopian nightmare experienced by ordinary citizens widened by the day, turning cities like Raqqa and Mosul into open-air prisons. As the military pressure from an international coalition of dozens of nations intensified day by day, al-Baghdadi's isolation grew even more severe. He could no longer afford to stay in fixed headquarters or urban safe houses. Coalition warplanes patrolled the skies above, and local informants walked the streets looking for suspicious movements that could lead to a multi-million-dollar bounty. He was forced to rely on a tight-knit circle of trusted family members and loyal tribal couriers who managed his food, water, and shelter. Rumors of his death, severe injury, or capture circulated through international news networks with regular frequency, each one forcing his media office to release fresh audio recordings to prove to his followers that the invisible leader was still alive. These audio messages became his primary lifeline to the outside world. In recordings that would last anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes, Al-Baghdadi's raspy, measured voice would drone through religious verses, commentary on current geopolitical conflicts, and calls for unwavering perseverance. He would address the defeats on the battlefield not as failures of his divine mission, but as necessary trials sent by God to separate true believers from hypocrites. He urged his fighters to hold their ground, to carry out attacks in their home countries if they could not travel to Syria or Iraq, and to turn every city into a graveyard for the invading armies. His voice carried an hypnotic authority for his followers, reinforcing the myth that he was a man touched by destiny, an ascetic warrior standing alone against a corrupt world. Yet, beneath the religious rhetoric, a deep sense of paranoia began to define his final years in hiding. He trusted fewer and fewer people, rotating his sleeping quarters frequently and avoiding any predictable routines. The myth of the hidden leader had become his protective armor, but it was also a golden cage. He was a ruler of a crumbling empire who could no longer see the vast territory he claimed to govern, relying entirely on second-hand reports brought by tired couriers who risked their lives just to reach his door. The man who had started as a quiet, studious religious figure in the neighborhoods of Fallujah had successfully transformed himself into an untouchable ghost, completely cut off from the physical world, waiting out the slow, inevitable approach of his own destruction. The vast military machine that began to crush the Islamic State did not materialize overnight. For years, the rapid territorial expansion of ISIS across large swaths of Iraq and Syria had left regional and global powers struggling to catch up. Governments in Washington, London, Paris, and regional capitals watched with growing alarm as black flags flew over major urban centers, oil fields, and ancient historical sites. By the middle of the decade, a broad international coalition of more than 80 nations was formed, united by a single objective: to dismantle the self-proclaimed Caliphate and destroy the military capacity of the organization that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi had built. This campaign was not fought solely with boots on the ground. It was a massive, multidimensional war that combined relentless air power, intelligence sharing, financial blockades, and local ground forces. From operations centers equipped with glowing monitors, satellite feeds, and digital maps, military commanders coordinated a relentless aerial bombing campaign. High-altitude reconnaissance planes, unmanned drones, and fighter jets patrolled the skies over Iraq and Syria 24 hours a day. Every movement of ISIS military columns, supply trucks, and command outposts was tracked and analyzed. When targets were identified, precision-guided munitions were deployed to strike them with devastating accuracy. Day after day, week after week, the coalition air campaign systematically dismantled the infrastructure that sustained al-Baghdadi's empire. Bridges were disabled to cut off supply lines, oil refineries and tanker fleets used to finance the organization's operations were bombed into ruins, and headquarters buildings in cities like Raqqa and Mosul were reduced to rubble. Yet, air power alone could not clear cities or hold territory. The burden of the ground war fell heavily upon a complex and often uneasy alliance of local ground forces. In Iraq, the shattered Iraqi security forces, rebuilt with foreign training and equipment, slowly regained their footing. Alongside them fought the Popular Mobilization Forces, a coalition of mostly Shia militias, as well as elite Kurdish Peshmerga fighters who defended their northern homelands with fierce determination. Across the border in Syria, the primary ground partner for the international coalition became the Syrian Democratic Forces, a multi-ethnic alliance dominated by Kurdish fighters. These local ground forces, supported by coalition special operations units, artillery, and close air support, began the grueling, house-by-house liberation of towns and cities that had suffered under militant rule for years. The fighting was grinding, destructive, and immensely costly. ISIS fighters offered fanatical resistance, turning residential neighborhoods into defensive fortresses. They planted thousands of improvised explosive devices along roads, used car bombs driven by suicide attackers to halt advancing columns, and utilized networks of underground tunnels to launch surprise counterattacks. Snipers occupied ruined buildings, and mortar teams shelled civilian areas indiscriminately. As the coalition ground forces pushed deeper into urban centers, the physical cost of the war became evident in the shattered concrete, collapsed bridges, and miles of scarred landscapes. Every block recaptured required intense coordination between ground infantry and overhead air support, transforming ancient cities into zones of heavy destruction. Beyond the military battlefields, a parallel war was fought in the shadows of the digital world. Governments and technology companies cracked down on the online propaganda networks that ISIS had masterminded. Social media platforms shut down thousands of accounts used to spread recruitment videos, radical magazines, and encrypted messaging channels. Financial intelligence units tracked the flow of illicit money through underground networks, cutting off the cash streams that paid fighters and purchased weapons. The global coalition worked tirelessly to stem the flow of foreign fighters traveling through Turkey into Syria, tightening border security and sharing intelligence to intercept potential recruits before they could reach militant-held territory. As the military pressure intensified, the true nature of the organization's rule was exposed to the wider world through the accounts of those who managed to escape. Refugees fleeing the shrinking caliphate told harrowing stories of life under totalitarian religious police, public executions for minor infractions, and systemic starvation. The international campaign was fueled not just by geopolitical strategy, but by the urgent need to stop the widespread atrocities and human suffering occurring daily within the borders of the self-proclaimed state. Every lost town and destroyed military cache chipped away at the invincible image that al-Baghdadi's media machine had worked so hard to construct. For al-Baghdadi, sitting in his hidden safe houses, the news from the front lines was grim. Reports brought by exhausted couriers detailed the loss of key strongholds, the depletion of weapons reserves, and the steady advance of enemy forces toward the heart of the Caliphate. The expansive territory that had once stretched across hundreds of miles of desert and river valleys was shrinking month by month. The oil revenues that once funded lavish military operations dried up, and the influx of foreign fighters slowed to a trickle as borders closed. The war against the world was entering its final, desperate phase, and the invisible leader found himself watching his grand empire slowly dismantled piece by a coalition too powerful to stop. The great territorial empire that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi had proclaimed with such grand ambition began to disintegrate under the relentless pressure of the international military campaign. Month by month, the vast swaths of land across Iraq and Syria that had once formed the backbone of the self-styled Caliphate were methodically clawed back by coalition-backed forces. Major urban strongholds, administrative centers, and frontline positions that had long served as symbols of militant dominance fell one by one. The loss of these territories marked a catastrophic turning point for the organization, reducing its sprawling domains into isolated pockets of resistance surrounded by hostile forces. In Iraq, the grueling urban battles culminated in the clearing of major cities, forcing surviving fighters to retreat or blend back into civilian populations. Across the border in Syria, the campaign systematically dismantled the infrastructure of the state that ISIS had spent years constructing. Raqqa, the de facto capital where al-Baghdadi's administrative apparatus had once operated in plain sight, was reduced to a landscape of ruined buildings and cleared streets after months of intense urban combat. With the loss of urban centers came the collapse of the economic engines that had sustained the organization. Oil fields, refineries, and major transit routes were recaptured, cutting off the vast revenues that had previously funded military operations, equipment purchases, and the salaries of thousands of recruits. As the physical borders of the Caliphate shrank toward vanishing points along the Euphrates River Valley, the internal dynamics of the organization shifted dramatically. The grand illusion of a permanent, expanding territorial state gave way to the harsh reality of military defeat. Supply lines were completely severed, halting the movement of heavy weapons and reinforcements. The steady influx of foreign fighters, which had once swelled the ranks of the organization with tens of thousands of recruits from around the world, slowed to a complete halt as borders were tightly sealed by regional governments and international security forces. Thousands of militants were killed in the fighting or captured, while others abandoned their positions, shedding their uniforms and hiding their weapons in an attempt to escape detection. For Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi himself, this systemic collapse meant a drastic change in daily survival. The invisible leader, who had once orchestrated grand strategies and occasionally emerged to deliver public declarations, was forced to retreat entirely into the shadows. Safe houses that had once felt secure in the heart of friendly territory became vulnerable liability zones as enemy intelligence networks closed in. Couriers brought increasingly grim dispatches detailing the loss of provincial commanders, the depletion of hidden weapons caches, and the steady encroachment of hostile forces toward the final remaining patches of land under militant control. To survive the relentless aerial surveillance and ground tracking, al-Baghdadi had to abandon all outward trappings of leadership and statehood. He became a fugitive once again, moving constantly through remote rural areas, safe houses, and underground hideouts in the rugged terrains of the Syrian desert and northern regions. Abandoning electronic communication entirely to avoid signals intelligence and drone strikes, he relied on a shrinking circle of loyal couriers and trusted family members to maintain contact with the remnants of his fractured organization. The sprawling empire that had once commanded global attention had been reduced to a fugitive existence, marking the end of the territorial caliphate and forcing the secretive leader into his final, desperate concealment. The hunt for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was one of the most complex, protracted, and technologically advanced intelligence operations in modern military history. For years, as the physical territory of the self-proclaimed caliphate fractured and dissolved under the relentless pressure of coalition air campaigns and ground offensives, intelligence agencies across multiple nations pieced together a massive puzzle. Every intercepted message, every captured courier, and every piece of digital debris recovered from abandoned administrative offices in Iraq and Syria served as a thread in a growing web of surveillance. The United States Central Intelligence Agency, working in close coordination with Kurdish intelligence services, Iraqi security forces, and specialized military tracking units, gradually narrowed the focus from vast regional territories down to specific pockets, towns, and ultimately individuals. Following the complete collapse of the territorial empire and the loss of his final strongholds along the Euphrates River Valley, al-Baghdadi had vanished completely from public view. He did not issue audio recordings or video addresses for extended periods, deepening the mystery of his whereabouts and forcing intelligence analysts to rely entirely on human intelligence networks and signals interception where possible. Because al-Baghdadi had learned harsh lessons from the fates of previous militant leaders, he strictly avoided modern telecommunications. He used no mobile phones, no satellite internet, and no electronic devices that could emit signals capable of being detected by airborne electronic warfare platforms. Instead, he relied on a tightly knit network of trusted couriers, family members, and loyal associates who traveled covertly across rural landscapes to deliver messages, coordinate logistics, and manage his daily needs. Despite these rigorous operational security measures, human beings leave traces. As local populations grew increasingly weary of the devastation brought by extremist rule, and as former fighters and sympathizers were captured or displaced, informants began to provide crucial leads. Intelligence operatives began tracking a specific courier network that had been moving supplies and relaying messages across northern Syria. By meticulously following the movements of these couriers over many months, Analysts were able to map out a pattern of travel that led away from the contested front lines and deep into the Idlib Governorate, a densely populated and politically fragmented region controlled by rival insurgent groups, local militias, and displaced populations. The trail eventually pointed toward a quiet, unassuming rural village named Barisha, located in the northern Idlib countryside near the Turkish border. Unlike the desert hideouts or rugged mountain caves, where many fugitive commanders sought refuge, al-Baghdadi's final sanctuary was an isolated residential compound situated on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by olive groves and open agricultural fields. The building appeared modest from the outside, a single-story concrete block structure with an adjacent fenced yard, designed to blend seamlessly into the rural architecture of the local farming community without drawing undue attention from neighbors or passing travelers. Yet, despite its ordinary appearance, subtle tactical anomalies caught the attention of intelligence spotters. The compound featured unusual security enhancements, such as reinforced walls, blocked windows facing away from neighboring properties, and a dedicated underground cellar system that would later be revealed as a critical escape route and hiding space. Piecing together corroborating intelligence, agencies utilized high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, advanced thermal imaging, and human assets on the ground to confirm that a high-value target matching al-Baghdadi's description was residing inside the compound. The confirmation process required immense patience and risk, as operatives had to verify identities without alerting the inhabitants or sparking premature flight. Informants within the courier network were activated, providing intimate details about the daily routines inside the house, the layout of the interior rooms, and the presence of family members and armed guards who provided round-the-clock security. Every detail was meticulously cross-referenced to ensure that the man hiding behind the olive groves was indeed the elusive leader of ISIS. As the intelligence picture solidified, planning for a high-risk special operations raid began in absolute secrecy. Military planners faced a uniquely hostile operational environment. The Idlib region was a complex patchwork of hostile armed factions, heavily defended airspace, and unpredictable local dynamics. Any military intervention would require precision timing, deep penetration into contested airspace, and flawless execution by elite operators trained for complex urban and rural assaults. The mission plan had to account for the possibility of booby traps, suicide vests, hidden reinforcement routes, and the risk of civilian casualties in the surrounding area. Weeks were spent constructing a full-scale mock-up of the Barisha compound at a secure training facility, allowing assault teams to practice breaching techniques, navigate interior hallways, and rehearse every second of the operation under simulated night conditions. By late October 2019, all components of the operation were fully aligned. The intelligence was deemed actionable and verified to the highest possible degree of certainty. The President of the United States authorized the direct action raid, setting into motion a coordinated sequence of events involving multiple military branches, intelligence agencies, and logistical support networks operating across international borders. The stage was set for an assault that would penetrate the deepest layers of secrecy, protecting the world's most wanted fugitive, bringing an end to years of clandestine evasion, and closing the final chapter on the hidden leader's life. On the night of October 26, 2019, the quiet rural landscape of the Idlib Governorate in northwestern Syria became the setting for one of the most significant military operations in modern history. Operation Kayla Mueller, named in honor of the young American humanitarian worker who had been taken hostage, abused, and ultimately killed by ISIS, was officially set in motion. The operation brought together months of intense preparation, multi-agency coordination, and precise intelligence gathering. Elite operators from the United States Army's Joint Special Operations Command, primarily drawn from the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, commonly known as Delta Force, were tasked with executing the high-risk direct action raid. They were supported by specialized military working dogs, combat air controllers, and a massive network of aerial surveillance platforms monitoring every movement around the target location in real time. Under the cover of complete darkness, 8 MH-47 Chinook and MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters lifted off from a military airbase in Iraq. Their flight path required them to navigate through highly contested and dangerous airspace, controlled by various hostile factions and foreign militaries. Flying at extremely low altitudes to avoid radar detection, the aircrews maneuvered through valleys and terrain features for over an hour and a half. The low-altitude flight served to minimize the risk of anti-aircraft fire from ground forces and kept the task force hidden until the very last moment. As the formation approached the compound on the outskirts of the small village of Barisha, just a few miles from the Turkish border, the quiet night was suddenly broken by the heavy mechanical roar of incoming rotor blades. Before the assault transport helicopters landed, defensive weapons aboard the aircraft and supporting attack helicopters engaged armed militants on the ground who had opened fire on the approaching formation. Within seconds, the protective perimeter around the compound was neutralized, ensuring that the primary assault team could land safely. Rather than using the main entry gates or front doors, which were heavily suspected of being rigged with explosive booby traps, the operators executed a breach directly through the exterior walls of the compound. Utilizing precise explosive breaching charges, the assault force blew a hole through the concrete perimeter wall, creating an immediate and unexpected entry point that caught the occupants inside off guard. Over loudspeakers, Arabic-speaking team members called out instructions to the occupants of the compound, demanding that they surrender peacefully. Several adults and children complied with the orders and moved out of the main structure into the courtyard, where they were immediately secured and evaluated by the operators. However, a core group of loyal fighters and family members refused to surrender. During the initial clearing operations, 5 armed fighters inside the compound, 4 women and 1 man, refused instructions, exhibited hostile intent, and were engaged and killed by the assault team. The operators moved methodically from room to room, clearing the complex using night vision equipment, suppressors, and flashbang grenades to secure each area while minimizing non-combatant casualties. As the ground force systematically secured the main living quarters and outbuildings, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi realized that escape was impossible. Trapped within his own sanctuary and cut off from any external help, he fled into the interconnected network of subterranean tunnels running beneath the compound. He took 3 young children with him, using them as human shields in a desperate attempt to delay or deter the pursuing assault team. Armed operators, accompanied by specialized military working dogs trained to navigate narrow underground spaces, entered the entrance of the primary tunnel and began their pursuit. Among the military dogs was Conan, a Belgian Malinois who advanced quickly down the dark passageway, cornering the fugitive leader at the end of a dead-end tunnel. Realizing that he was completely trapped with no alternative route or chance of breakout, al-Baghdadi reached his final moment. Rather than face capture and a public trial, he detonated a suicide vest packed with explosives that he was wearing beneath his clothing. The resulting blast killed al-Baghdadi instantly and killed the 3 young children he had forced into the tunnel with him. The explosion caused a partial collapse of the subterranean tunnel, filling the narrow space with heavy dust, smoke, and concrete debris. Despite the destruction caused by the blast, the assault team immediately worked to secure the area and perform sensitive site exploitation. Operators cleared the fallen rubble inside the tunnel to access the remains of the ISIS leader. To confirm his identity beyond any doubt, team members performed immediate, preliminary DNA testing on site using specialized portable equipment. Biological samples extracted from the remains were cross-referenced with reference DNA samples previously obtained from al-Baghdadi during his time in U.S. military custody at Camp Bakr in 2004. Within minutes, the field testing confirmed a positive match, providing conclusive proof that the world's most wanted terrorist leader was dead. In addition to confirming al-Baghdadi's death, the assault force spent approximately 2 hours conducting an exhaustive search of the entire Barisha compound. They gathered a massive trove of actionable intelligence materials, including encrypted electronic devices, cell phones, flash drives, financial ledgers, and internal administrative documents. This captured material provided intelligence agencies with an invaluable window into the remaining operational structure, hiding spots, and financial networks of ISIS across the region. Before departing the site, the ground force removed the remains of al-Baghdadi for further laboratory verification and respectful disposal in accordance with international maritime law. Ultimately buried at sea within 24 hours of his death to prevent his burial site from becoming a shrine for future extremists. To prevent the compound from being used as a gathering place, memorial, or defensive fortress by remaining insurgent groups, American forces launched precision airstrikes against the site shortly after the assault team evacuated. Precision-guided munitions completely leveled the concrete structures, leaving behind nothing but a cratered field of rubble surrounded by olive trees. The physical sanctuary where the ISIS leader spent his final days had been entirely erased from the landscape. On the morning of October 27, 2019, the President of the United States officially announced the success of the raid to the world during a live national television address from the White House. The public announcement provided key details of the night operation, confirming al-Baghdadi's death and thanking the military personnel, intelligence analysts, and foreign partners who had contributed to the multi-year effort. The news spread rapidly across the globe, dominating headlines and sparking widespread reactions throughout the Middle East and international security communities. For ISIS, the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi represented a devastating psychological and operational blow. Al-Baghdadi had been more than just a top commander. He was the central figure whose personal religious credentials and strategic ambition had sustained the concept of the Caliphate. His self-proclaimed authority had served as the primary ideological anchor for thousands of foreign fighters who had traveled to Iraq and Syria to join his cause. His sudden, violent death in an isolated hideout far from his former territorial strongholds dramatically undermined the group's narrative of divine victory and inevitable expansion. Within days of the raid, the Leadership Council of ISIS moved quickly to contain the damage and maintain continuity of command. Through its central media channels, the organization officially acknowledged al-Baghdadi's death and announced the appointment of a successor, Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurashi. By adopting a title that claimed descent from the Prophet's tribe, the group attempted to preserve the religious authority of its leadership structure. However, the new leader inherited a fractured, underground organization stripped of its territorial empire, its major revenue streams, and its most prominent figurehead. The elimination of al-Baghdadi marked the definitive end of an era for global jihadism, but it did not instantly eliminate the threat posed by the movement he had built. While the central leadership structure was disrupted and forced deeper underground, local cells, regional franchises, and decentralized networks across Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East continued to operate independently. Nevertheless, the raid at Barisha closed the chapter on the hidden leader who had transformed a local Iraqi insurgency into a global menace, leaving behind a legacy of destruction, fractured nations, and a ruined caliphate. The final chapter of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's life and the history of the territorial Islamic State invites a sober reflection on one of the darkest periods in modern Middle Eastern history. To understand his historical legacy is to examine how a quiet, studious religious figure from an ordinary Iraqi town ascended through the chaos of war, religious extremism, and institutional breakdown to become one of the most notorious terrorist leaders the world has ever known. Al-Baghdadi's journey from a modest background to the self-proclaimed caliph of a vast, brutal empire demonstrates the dangerous potency of extremist ideology when fused with systemic societal collapse, foreign intervention, and sectarian violence. Yet, his eventual demise in a secluded Syrian hideout, hunted down by elite special operations forces, serves as a stark testament to the relentless reach of international counterterrorism and the ultimate unsustainability of building a regime on terror, cruelty, and unrelenting conquest. The human cost of ISIS remains staggering and immeasurable. Millions of innocent civilians across Iraq and Syria were displaced from their homes, forced to flee across borders as refugees, or subjected to unimaginable violence under the harsh, draconian rules of the self-styled Caliphate. Entire cities, ancient cultural heritage sites, religious monuments, schools, hospitals, and residential neighborhoods were reduced to dust and rubble by years of intense urban warfare, sieges, and heavy airstrikes. Ethnic and religious minorities, including Yazidis, Christians, Turkmen, and Shia Muslims, faced systematic persecution, displacement, and genocide, leaving deep, enduring scars on the social fabric of pluralistic societies that had thrived for centuries. Even after the physical territory of the Caliphate was dismantled, thousands of grieving families continued to search for missing loved ones, struggling to rebuild shattered lives in communities scarred by trauma, destruction, and economic ruin. Despite the loss of its territorial strongholds and the elimination of its central leadership, the ideology propagated by al-Baghdadi did not simply vanish with the collapse of his regime. The decentralized network model that ISIS adopted ensured that loyal cells, underground affiliates, and regional branches across parts of Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East could continue to operate, recruit, and launch sporadic attacks long after the loss of Mosul and Raqqa. The digital footprint left behind by the group's sophisticated propaganda machinery continued to radicalize vulnerable individuals online, spreading extremist narratives across global borders through encrypted messaging apps and underground forums. Security analysts and international governments recognized that defeating an ideology requires more than military intervention and territorial conquest. It demands sustained efforts in counter-radicalization, economic rebuilding, good governance, and community reconciliation to address the root grievances that allowed extremism to flourish in the first place. The story of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi stands as a profound historical warning about the fragility of peace and the devastating consequences of allowing extremism to fester in the shadows of war. From his early days studying religious texts in Iraq to his imprisonment at Camp Bakr, his rise through the ranks of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, his fateful break with global jihadist leadership, and his ultimate manifestation as the hidden caliph of a ruined empire, his life trajectory mirrors the tragic unraveling of the region he sought to dominate. The ruined caliphate he left behind stands as a haunting monument to fanaticism, a physical and psychological wasteland born of hatred and ambition. As nations work to heal the deep wounds left by his reign, history will remember al-Baghdadi not as a builder of empires, but as the architect of a catastrophic chapter of human suffering